Case 1. Michelle Martens. August 22, 2016, Albuquerque, New Mexico. There are moments in the history of a city when the ground shifts beneath the community's feet. When a story emerges from behind closed doors that is so deeply painful, so fundamentally contrary to every instinct of human decency, that an entire region finds itself struggling to comprehend how something so terrible could have happened so close to home. For the people of Albuquerque, New Mexico, August 22, 2016, became one of those moments. It was a date that would be etched permanently into the conscience of a city, a date that would spark urgent conversations about child protection, about accountability, about the systems designed to safeguard the most vulnerable among us, and about what happens when every single one of those systems fails at the same time. Albuquerque is a city of remarkable contrasts. It sits at the base of the Sandia Mountains in the high desert of central New Mexico, a city of more than 500,000 people where cultures, histories, and communities intertwine in ways both beautiful and complex. Like every major American city, it carries within it neighborhoods of warmth, ambition, and resilience alongside areas where poverty, addiction, and instability create environments where children can become invisible to the very institutions meant to protect them. It is within one of those invisible spaces that the story of Victoria Martens began, and where it ended, far too soon. Victoria Martens was 10 years old. She had just celebrated her birthday. 10 years old is an age of wonder, of growing curiosity, of beginning to understand the world in new and expanding ways. It is an age when a child should feel safe, nurtured, and unconditionally loved. Victoria deserved every one of those things. Instead, what was discovered in an Albuquerque apartment in the early morning hours of August 22nd would become one of the most heartbreaking and widely reported cases in New Mexico history. A case that exposed not only the actions of those directly responsible, but also the broader failures of a system that had multiple opportunities to intervene and did not. The call that came into Albuquerque Police Department dispatch in the early hours of that August morning was distressing from the first moment. Officers were directed to an apartment on the northeast side of the city. What they encountered when they arrived went beyond what most law enforcement professionals, even those with years of experience handling difficult cases, were prepared for. Inside that apartment, they found evidence of profound harm done to a child, injuries and circumstances that left investigators shaken and that would fuel weeks of national media coverage in the days that followed. Victoria Martens had not survived. She was found inside the apartment where she lived with her mother, Michelle Martens. The conditions investigators documented that night were described in subsequent court proceedings and media reports as among the most disturbing they had ever encountered. The nature of what had been done to Victoria, the full scope of the harm she had suffered, was so severe that prosecutors would later describe it in terms that shocked jurors, journalists, and members of the public who followed the case closely. Michelle Martens was 35 years old at the time. She was Victoria's mother, the one adult in the world whose most fundamental obligation was to protect her daughter from harm. Instead, investigators alleged, Michelle had not only failed in that obligation, but had actively participated in creating the conditions that led to Victoria's death. She was taken into custody on the morning of August 22nd, and within hours, her name was being broadcast across local and national news outlets as authorities worked to piece together what had happened inside that apartment. 2 other individuals were also arrested in connection with the case. Fabian Gonzalez, who was Michelle's boyfriend, and Jessica Kelly, a woman who had been present in the apartment, were both taken into custody and charged alongside Michelle. The 3 arrests immediately complicated the public's understanding of the case, raising urgent questions about who had done what, who had known what, and, most painfully, what Victoria had endured in the time leading up to that night. As investigators dug deeper into the circumstances surrounding Victoria's death, a picture emerged that was as complex as it was deeply troubling. Michelle Martens had been known to Child Protective Services in New Mexico. The family had come to the attention of authorities on prior occasions, and yet Victoria had remained in the home. This detail, the fact that warning signs had existed and that the system had not removed Victoria from danger, became one of the central points of public anguish and policy debate in the aftermath of the case. New Mexico's Children, Youth, and Families Department, known as CYFD, came under intense scrutiny. Advocates, politicians, and members of the public demanded answers about how a child who had been on the radar of protective services could end up suffering the fate that Victoria suffered. Investigations were launched. Reports were compiled. Officials were questioned. The case became a catalyst for serious conversations about caseworker caseloads, the adequacy of funding for child protection services, and the legal and procedural frameworks governing when and how children are removed from dangerous situations. In the immediate aftermath of the arrests, all three defendants, Michelle Martens, Fabian Gonzalez, and Jessica Kelly, were charged with serious crimes including child abuse resulting in death. The charges carried potentially severe penalties, and the Bernalillo County District Attorney's Office made clear from early on that the case would be prosecuted with the full weight of the law. The legal proceedings that followed were lengthy, complex, and at times deeply confusing to outside observers. One of the most startling developments came when DNA evidence collected at the scene suggested the possible presence of a fourth individual whose identity had not yet been established. This revelation sent the investigation in new directions and added yet another layer of uncertainty to a case that was already extraordinarily difficult to fully comprehend. Jessica Kelly, who had been present during the events of that night, became a key figure in the prosecution strategy. Investigators worked to understand her exact role in what had occurred, and her legal proceedings moved forward alongside those of Michelle and Fabian Gonzalez. Each defendant navigated the process differently, and the courtroom chapters of this story unfolded over the course of several years, with hearings, plea negotiations, and legal arguments playing out in front of Bernalillo County judges as the community watched and waited for resolution. Michelle Martens ultimately entered a guilty plea. She pleaded guilty to charges of child abuse resulting in death, acknowledging in open court her role in what had happened to her daughter. The plea spared her from a trial, but it did not spare her from accountability. She was sentenced to a substantial prison term, a sentence that, for many observers, still felt wholly inadequate in the face of what Victoria had endured. Fabian Gonzalez also entered into plea proceedings, as did Jessica Kelly, each receiving sentences that reflected the criminal justice system's determination of their respective degrees of culpability. But for many people who had followed the case, for child advocates, for members of the public, for those who had come to know Victoria's story through media coverage, no sentence, however long, could fully address the enormity of what had been lost. A 10-year-old girl had lost her life on her birthday, in her own home, at the hands of the very people who should have been her protectors. The legacy of the Victoria Martens case extends far beyond the sentences handed down to those responsible. In New Mexico, the case accelerated reforms to the state's child protective services system. Legislation was introduced and debated. Budget allocations for CYFD were examined and, in some areas, increased. Advocacy organizations used Victoria's story, always with careful attention to her dignity and humanity, as a rallying point for the kind of systemic change that might prevent future tragedies. Victoria Martens deserved to grow up. She deserved the chance to discover who she would become, what she would love, what she would contribute to the world. She was 10 years old, and she deserved so much more than what her life and her death delivered to her. Her story is told here not to dwell in darkness, but to honor her memory and to affirm, loudly and unequivocally, that children like Victoria must be seen, by neighbors, by teachers, by community members, by every institution charged with their protection. The question that haunted Albuquerque after August 22, 2016, was not simply how three adults had committed acts of such profound harm. The deeper, harder question was why no one had stopped it sooner. That question carries no easy answers, but it demands that we continue asking it, for Victoria and for every child whose safety depends on whether the adults around them are paying attention. In 2019, the New Mexico Children's Code was amended with provisions that child safety advocates directly linked to the public outcry following Victoria's case. Caseworker protocols were revised. Oversight mechanisms were strengthened. The changes were meaningful, though advocates were careful to note that no reform can be considered complete as long as children remain at risk. Victoria Martens was a real child with a real life, a real smile, and a future that was stolen from her. She was not a statistic. She was not a headline. She was a little girl who turned 10 years old on the last day of her life, and she deserved the world. This case represents one of the most significant turning points in New Mexico's history of child protection, and it remains, to this day, a reminder of what is at stake when we fail to listen to the warning signs that vulnerable children cannot voice for themselves. Justice was delivered in part, but the full measure of accountability, the kind that changes systems and saves future lives, is a work that must continue, in Victoria's name and in the names of all children who cannot yet speak for themselves. If you are concerned about the safety of a child in your community, please contact the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-4-CHILD. Trained counselors are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and your call can make the difference between a child's safety and a tragedy that cannot be undone. If this story moved you, if Victoria's life means something to you, please take a moment right now to show your support for the work we do here. Like this video, leave a comment below with your thoughts, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss another story from Cold Case Time. Every like, every comment, every new subscriber tells the algorithm that stories like Victoria's matter, and that the truth deserves to be heard. Case 2. Kristina Withrow, 2023, Albuquerque, New Mexico. There is a particular kind of moral failure that defies easy categorization. It is not simply the failure of an individual to control their own impulses or to resist the temptations of anger, desperation, or cruelty. It is the failure of a parent, someone whose most sacred and irreversible responsibility is to guide, protect, and nurture another human life, to use that position for anything other than harm. It is the failure that occurs when a mother does not shield her child from the world's darkness, but instead points that child directly into it and says, in words or in actions, "This is what I need you to do." The case of Kristina Withrow is one of the most psychologically disturbing and legally compelling cases to emerge from New Mexico in the 21st century. It is a case that asks hard questions not only about individual criminal culpability, but about the dynamics of parental influence, the vulnerability of young adults to manipulation by those who raised them, and the catastrophic consequences that unfold when a mother weaponizes the bond between parent and child. Kristina Withrow was a woman living in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in the early months of 2023. She had a son, a young man who, like all children regardless of their age, looked to his parent for guidance, for a model of how to navigate a difficult world. What he received instead was something no child should ever receive from the person who brought them into the world, a directive to commit an act of violence against another human being. The victim in this case was Monique Garcia, a homeless woman living in the Albuquerque area. Monique Garcia was a vulnerable member of the community, a person without the protections and resources that stable housing and social support networks provide. She was, in many ways, the kind of person who exists at the margins of public visibility, the kind of person whose disappearance or harm might not immediately trigger the widespread attention and alarm that a more socially connected victim might receive. And it was precisely this vulnerability that appears to have made her a target. According to investigators and the evidence presented at trial, Kristina Withrow handed a firearm to her son, who was 18 years old at the time, and instructed him to use it against Monique Garcia. The specifics of the motivation behind this directive became a central focus of the investigation. What had Monique Garcia done, or what had Kristina Withrow believed she had done, that led a mother to cross the most fundamental line a parent can cross? What grievance, what fear, what distorted calculation had brought Withrow to the point of placing a weapon in her child's hands and giving him an instruction that no mother should ever give? The investigation into Monique Garcia's death unfolded over a period of weeks, with Albuquerque Police Department detectives working methodically through the evidence to establish not only what had happened, but who had orchestrated it. The forensic evidence, witness accounts, and the investigative trail that prosecutors ultimately assembled painted a picture of premeditation, of a mother who had not acted in a moment of uncontrolled impulse, but had made a deliberate decision to direct violence through her son. Withrow's son was also arrested and faced charges in connection with the shooting. The legal proceedings that followed were carefully constructed to address the distinct but interconnected culpability of both the individual who had pulled the trigger and the individual who had given the order. This distinction, between the person who physically committed the act and the person who had directed it, became one of the defining legal questions in a case that drew attention from legal scholars and true crime commentators across the country. The prosecution's approach to the Withrow case was notable for its thoroughness. Prosecutors argued that Kristina Withrow bore primary moral and legal responsibility for Monique Garcia's death, not in spite of the fact that she had not been the one to physically carry out the act, but because of it. The act of directing another person, particularly one's own child, to commit a crime elevates the moral culpability of the director in ways that the law has long recognized. A parent who uses their authority, their emotional hold, and their child's loyalty as instruments of violence is not less responsible than someone who acts directly. In many ways, the law and the community's moral instincts align in concluding that such a parent bears a particular and profound responsibility. The trial proceedings drew significant media attention, not only because of the shocking nature of the allegations, but because the case raised broader questions about the criminal justice system's approach to cases involving family members as co-defendants. Defense strategies in such cases often involve complicated questions of loyalty, coercion, and the degree to which a young adult can truly be said to have acted independently when the instruction to act came from a parent. These questions were examined carefully by the jury tasked with determining Withrow's fate. Kristina Withrow was convicted of second-degree murder. The verdict, when it was delivered, was met with a mixture of relief and solemnity by those who had followed the case. Relief that the jury had seen through the complexity of the case to the clear truth at its center, that a woman had orchestrated the taking of a human life and used her own son as the instrument of that act. And solemnity, because the truth at the center of this case is a painful one that touches on the most fundamental questions of what it means to be a parent and what it means to fail catastrophically in that role. Withrow was sentenced to 26 years in prison. The sentence was substantial, and it reflected the jury's and the court's determination that the gravity of what she had done demanded serious accountability. 26 years meant that Kristina Withrow would spend a significant portion of the remainder of her life incarcerated, time during which the consequences of her choices would be measured not only in terms of her own lost freedom, but in terms of the permanent and irreversible impact on every life touched by the events of that day. Monique Garcia deserved to be alive. She deserved the same protections, the same presumption of safety, and the same basic dignity that every human being is owed. The fact that she was homeless did not make her life worth less. The fact that she was living on the margins did not make her pain less real or her loss less profound. Her death left a void in the lives of those who knew her, and her story deserves to be told with the same seriousness and respect that we would give to any victim, regardless of their circumstances. For Withrow's son, the young man who was placed in the impossible position of receiving such an instruction from his own mother, the path forward is one that carries its own particular weight. Whatever the legal outcomes of his individual proceedings, the psychological and emotional burden of what his mother directed him to do is something that will likely shape the rest of his life. He, too, is in some measure a victim of Kristina Withrow's choices, even as he also bears his own legal and moral accountability for his actions. The case of Kristina Withrow stands as a stark reminder that the harm parents can cause their children is not limited to direct physical harm. It includes the harm of corruption, of teaching a child that violence is a tool available to them, that human life is expendable, and that a parent's directive supersedes the fundamental moral and legal prohibitions that govern civilized society. That is a lesson no child should ever be taught, and a lesson that carries consequences far beyond any single act of violence. New Mexico's legal system delivered a measure of accountability in this case. But the deeper work, the work of understanding why and how a mother arrives at such a point, and what communities and institutions can do to intervene before such a point is reached, is work that must continue, in courts and in counseling rooms, and in the broader social fabric of communities where families in crisis need support before they reach the breaking point. Monique Garcia's life mattered. Her story deserves to be remembered not just as a footnote in a criminal case, but as the story of a human being who was taken from the world by an act of calculated cruelty. We honor her memory by taking seriously the obligation to protect vulnerable people in our communities, people who, by virtue of their circumstances, may not have anyone else looking out for them. If this story raised questions for you about how our communities support vulnerable individuals, please consider reaching out to your local homeless outreach organizations or victim advocacy centers. Every act of community care, however small, contributes to a safer world for everyone. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment sharing your thoughts on this case, and make sure you've hit that subscribe button so you stay connected with Cold Case Time. Your support keeps these stories alive and ensures that victims like Monique Garcia are never forgotten. Case 3. Alexee Trevizo. January 27, 2023, Ortiz-Chavez, New Mexico. Few stories in the true crime landscape generate as much public debate, as much online discussion, and as much genuine, complicated human emotion as cases involving the deaths of newborn infants. These are cases that sit at the intersection of law, medicine, psychology, and profound social questions about how we as a society support, or fail to support, young women facing unplanned pregnancies. They are cases that demand careful, nuanced examination, because the circumstances that lead to them are rarely simple, and the responses they inspire rarely reflect the full complexity of what actually occurred. The case of Alexee Trevizo is one of those stories. It emerged from Ortiz-Chavez, New Mexico, a small city of approximately 12,000 people in the Pecos Valley region of the southeastern part of the state, in the early weeks of 2023. It became a viral story almost immediately, spreading across TikTok, YouTube, true crime podcasts, and mainstream news platforms with a speed that reflected both the inherent emotional power of the case and the deep divisions it exposed in public opinion about issues of youth, pregnancy, and accountability. Alexee Trevizo was 19 years old on the night of January 27, 2023. She arrived at Ortiz-Chavez General Hospital with what she described as severe abdominal pain. She was examined by hospital staff, who had their own assessments of her condition. What happened next, in the hours that followed her arrival at that hospital, became the subject of criminal charges, legal battles, intense media scrutiny, and a national conversation that showed no signs of quieting even months after the initial events. According to the account that emerged through law enforcement investigation and subsequent legal proceedings, Trevizo gave birth to a full-term baby boy in the bathroom of Ortiz-Chavez General Hospital during the early morning hours of January 28th. The birth, which hospital staff had not been informed was imminent, occurred without medical assistance. What happened in the aftermath of that birth, the actions that Trevizo took in the moments and minutes that followed, became the core of the criminal case against her. Investigators alleged that after giving birth, Trevizo placed the newborn in a trash bag. The baby was subsequently discovered by hospital staff, who responded with emergency medical measures. The infant did not survive. Trevizo was taken into custody and charged with first-degree murder, a charge that immediately sparked intense debate about whether that charge was appropriate given her age, the circumstances of the delivery, and the broader context of her situation. The legal proceedings in the Trevizo case became almost as significant a story as the events themselves. Defense attorneys filed motions challenging the admissibility of key evidence, arguing that statements Trevizo had made and evidence that had been collected had been obtained in ways that violated her constitutional rights. These legal arguments, which centered on questions of voluntary disclosure and the rights of individuals in medical settings, were heard and debated in Eddy County court proceedings over the course of several months. One of the most significant legal battlegrounds in the case involved surveillance footage from the hospital. Prosecutors sought to use this footage, which they argued captured critical moments of what had occurred, as evidence. Defense attorneys contested its use, raising questions about the chain of custody, the conditions under which it was obtained, and whether its admission would be consistent with the defendant's rights. These legal battles were closely watched by criminal defense attorneys and legal scholars across the country who saw the case as a potential landmark for questions at the intersection of medical privacy and criminal investigation. The background that investigators and reporters uncovered about Alexee Trevizo added further layers of complexity to a case that was already extraordinarily difficult to assess with simple moral certainty. She was a young woman, a teenager still, in many respects, who had reportedly concealed her pregnancy not only from hospital staff, but from family members and others in her life. The question of why she had concealed it, and what that concealment reflected about her mental state, her fears, and her circumstances in the months leading up to January 28th, became important threads in both the legal proceedings and the public discussion. Medical and psychological experts who were consulted in the coverage of the case spoke about the phenomenon of pregnancy denial, a psychological condition recognized by medical professionals in which a pregnant woman, often due to extreme psychological distress, is unable to fully acknowledge or process the reality of her pregnancy. The degree to which this condition was present in Trevizo's case, and the degree to which it might be relevant to questions of intent and culpability, was a matter that the legal proceedings were designed in part to address. The charge of first-degree murder in the case of a newborn requires, under New Mexico law, proof of premeditation, of a deliberate and conscious decision, made in advance, to take a life. Defense attorneys argued vigorously that the circumstances of a young woman giving birth alone and in a state of extreme physical and psychological distress did not meet that legal standard. Prosecutors argued that the actions taken after the birth, placing the infant in a trash bag, constituted the deliberate act that the charge required. As of the most recent available reporting, the Trevizo case remained in active legal proceedings, with motions and hearings continuing to shape the path toward an eventual trial or resolution. The legal complexity of the case means that a final outcome may still be some time away. But the public significance of the case, its implications for how the law treats young women in crisis, how medical institutions navigate their dual obligations to patients and to potential crime victims, and how communities support young people facing unplanned pregnancies, will outlast whatever verdict or resolution the courts ultimately reach. The baby who lost his life in that hospital bathroom deserves to be acknowledged not as an abstraction or a legal concept, but as a person, a life that existed, however briefly, and that was entitled to the protection and care that every newborn deserves. His story is part of this case, and it deserves to be held with the same seriousness and grief that we bring to any loss of life. At the same time, the story of Alexee Trevizo, a 19-year-old woman in a situation of extreme vulnerability, fear, and crisis, demands that we ask serious questions about the support systems available to young women in communities across New Mexico and across the country. How many young women, facing unplanned pregnancies in circumstances of poverty, social stigma, family pressure, or fear, lack access to the counseling, medical support, and safe and legal options that might prevent tragedies like this one from occurring? These are questions that go beyond any individual case and touch on the kind of community and institutional responsibilities that a just society must take seriously. New Mexico, like many states, has safe haven laws that allow a parent to surrender a newborn at a hospital or other designated safe location without facing criminal prosecution. Whether Trevizo was aware of those laws, whether she was in a mental state that would have allowed her to act on that knowledge even if she possessed it, and what that awareness or lack of awareness reflects about the effectiveness of public education around safe haven options, these are questions worth examining carefully in the aftermath of this case. The Trevizo case is still unfolding. The legal chapters ahead will determine, at least in formal terms, what accountability looks like in this situation. But the broader chapters, the ones about how we as a society support young women, how we approach the mental health dimensions of crisis pregnancies, and how we hold space for the full complexity of human experience in our criminal justice frameworks. Those chapters are written by all of us, every day, in the choices we make about funding, access, education, and compassion. We honor the memory of the infant who lost his life on January 28, 2023, by taking all of these questions seriously and by committing to a world where no young woman and no newborn child is left without the support and options they need. If this story resonates with you, if you have thoughts on the case or on the broader issues it raises, please leave a comment below. We read every single one. And if you haven't yet subscribed to Cold Case Time, please do so now. Hit that bell notification so you're always the first to know when a new documentary drops. Your likes and your subscriptions are what allow this channel to keep telling stories that matter. Case 4. Mariah Zuni. 2024. Isleta Pueblo, New Mexico. There are cases that emerge from the true crime landscape that resist easy categorization. Cases that sit at the intersection of tragedy, mental health, and the irreversible loss of innocent life in ways that leave even experienced investigators and legal professionals searching for the words to adequately describe what they encountered. The case of Mariah Zuni is one of those cases. It is a case that unfolded in a community with its own unique history, cultural identity, and legal context, and that raised questions not only about individual actions, but about the support systems available to families in crisis in some of the most geographically and socially isolated communities in the American Southwest. Isleta Pueblo is a federally recognized Native American tribe located approximately 13 miles south of Albuquerque, along the banks of the Rio Grande. It is a community with a history stretching back centuries, a community of deep cultural heritage, strong family bonds, and traditions that have survived centuries of colonization, displacement, and upheaval. Like many tribal communities in the United States, it is also a community that has faced significant challenges in terms of access to mental health services, economic opportunity, and the kinds of social support infrastructure that can mean the difference between a family in crisis getting help and a family in crisis reaching a point of no return. It was within this community that Mariah Zuni, a young mother, allegedly committed an act in 2024 that sent shockwaves not only through Isleta Pueblo, but through the broader New Mexico community and the national media outlets that picked up the story in the days that followed. According to the federal charges filed against her, federal, because crimes committed on federally recognized tribal land fall under federal jurisdiction in many cases, Mariah Zuni allegedly took the lives of her 2 young sons. The children were identified as a 5-year-old boy and a 9-month-old infant. The ages of the victims made this case particularly devastating to comprehend. A 5-year-old and a baby. 2 children who represented the most vulnerable and innocent end of the human spectrum, whose entire existence depended on the care and protection of the adults around them. When law enforcement responded to the scene and spoke with Mariah Zuni, the explanation she offered was one that, in its own way, added another layer of incomprehensible pain to an already devastating situation. According to investigators, she told officers that she had harmed her children because she was protecting them. The word protecting, a word that in the context of motherhood should carry connotations of safety, warmth, and selfless sacrifice, was used here to describe the precise opposite of those things. What did she mean? What internal logic or distorted perception of reality had led her to a place where the act of harming her own children was framed in her own mind as an act of protection? These questions immediately became central to the legal and psychological dimensions of the case. The United States Attorney's Office for the District of New Mexico, which has jurisdiction over major crimes committed on tribal land under the Federal Major Crimes Act, took over the prosecution of the case. Mariah Zuni was charged with federal crimes including murder in connection with the deaths of her sons. The federal charges carried severe potential penalties, including the possibility of life imprisonment. The investigation that followed the initial arrest worked to reconstruct the timeline of events leading up to what occurred, to understand Mariah Zuni's mental state, her history, and the circumstances of her family in the period before the tragedy. These investigative threads are standard procedure in cases where the stated justification for an act of violence, "I was protecting them," suggests the possibility of serious psychological disturbance. Mental health professionals who were consulted in the coverage of the case spoke about the phenomenon of what is sometimes called altruistic filicide, cases in which a parent harms their own children based on a delusional belief that doing so spares the children from a worse fate. This psychological framework, when it is genuine, does not excuse the act or eliminate criminal culpability, but it does shape the legal proceedings in significant ways. Questions of competency to stand trial, of criminal intent, and of whether the defendant was capable of understanding the nature of their actions at the time they were committed becomes central to the legal process. The Isleta Pueblo community responded to the tragedy with a grief that was both public and deeply personal. This was not an abstract news story for them. These were community members, a mother and her children, known to neighbors, extended family members, and members of the tribal community in ways that go beyond what is possible in a large anonymous city. The loss of 2 young children from within a community that already carries the weight of historical trauma and contemporary challenges is a loss that reverberates through every level of communal life. Tribal leadership and community members spoke in the aftermath of the incident about the need for expanded mental health resources within Isleta Pueblo and within tribal communities across New Mexico and the broader United States. The Indian Health Service, which provides health care to many Native American communities, has long been documented as chronically underfunded relative to the needs of the populations it serves. Mental health services in particular have historically been among the most underserved areas within the Indian Health Service framework, leaving families in crisis with fewer options for intervention, support, and treatment than their counterparts in non-tribal communities with greater access to private and public mental health infrastructure. These systemic realities do not alter the facts of what occurred or the profound tragedy of 2 young lives lost, but they form an essential part of the context without which the full meaning of this case cannot be understood. Cases like Mariah Zuni's do not emerge from a vacuum. They emerge from the intersection of individual circumstances and systemic failures of access, of support, of early intervention. And addressing those systemic failures is a necessary part of any serious response to tragedies of this kind. The legal proceedings against Mariah Zuni were continuing as of the most recent available reporting. The federal charges meant that the case would be tried in federal court, with all the procedural distinctions that federal prosecution entails. Defense attorneys were working to build a case that addressed the mental health dimensions of the situation, while prosecutors were committed to pursuing accountability for the loss of 2 children who had no ability to protect themselves. The 5-year-old boy and the 9-month-old baby who lost their lives deserve to be remembered by name, by their laughter, by the specific and irreplaceable individuals they were in the brief time they were part of this world. They deserve to be held in the memory of their community not only as victims of a tragedy, but as real children who brought love and meaning to those who knew them. The case of Mariah Zuni is one of the most recent and, in many ways, one of the most complex cases in this documentary. It touches on issues of mental health, indigenous community welfare, federal jurisdiction, and the kinds of systemic support failures that can have devastating consequences for the most vulnerable members of any community. Understanding it fully requires holding multiple difficult truths at the same time. The truth of the harm that was done, the truth of the lives that were lost, and the truth of the systems that did not do enough to prevent this from happening. The children of Isleta Pueblo, and the children of every tribal community in the United States, deserve access to the mental health resources, family support services, and protective interventions that might mean the difference between a family in crisis receiving help and a family in crisis reaching a point where tragedy becomes unavoidable. Advocating for those resources is part of how we honor the memory of the 2 children at the center of this case. If you want to support mental health resources in Native American communities, the Native Alliance Against Violence operates a confidential hotline and a range of support services specifically designed for Indigenous individuals and families in crisis. Their work is vital and deserves the community's support. Please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who cares about true crime and justice, and subscribe to Cold Case Time if you haven't already. These stories exist to educate, to honor victims, and to spark the conversations that lead to real change. Your engagement is what makes that possible. Case 5. Krista Cruz. 2019, Albuquerque, New Mexico. Not all of the cases that fall within the framework of maternal crime involve a mother who directly harms her child with her own hands. Some of the most devastating cases in this category, and in many ways, some of the most morally complex, involve mothers whose culpability lies in what they chose not to do. Mothers who saw harm being done to their child and looked away. Mothers who heard their child suffering and chose silence over intervention. Mothers who possessed the power to stop the suffering of their own son or daughter and made the conscious decision not to use that power. In the eyes of the law and in the court of human conscience, that failure to act, that deliberate choice to do nothing, can be just as culpable as an act of direct violence. The case of Krista Cruz falls squarely within this category, and it is a case that illustrates, with painful clarity, the devastating consequences of a mother's failure to protect her child from harm that was visible, documented, and preventable. James Dunkley was 4 years old. He was Krista Cruz's son, and he lived with her in Albuquerque, New Mexico. By all accounts, James was a small boy in a vulnerable situation, a child whose world was bounded by the walls of the home he shared with his mother and, fatally, with other individuals whose presence in that home would prove to be profoundly dangerous to him. The circumstances that led to James Dunkley's death in 2019 involved a pattern of abuse that, according to investigators and the evidence presented in subsequent legal proceedings, had been ongoing for a significant period of time. James was not harmed in a single sudden act of violence. He was subjected to prolonged mistreatment, a sustained pattern of abuse that left marks on his small body, and that those who interacted with the household had opportunities to observe. The individual who was identified as the primary perpetrator of the physical abuse of James Dunkley was not Krista Cruz herself. It was another person living in or regularly present at the home, a person whose relationship to Cruz and whose access to James became the central factors in the investigation of how and why this child was allowed to suffer for so long before the consequences became fatal. Investigators documented that there had been warning signs, visible indicators of the harm being done to James that were known to those around him, including, crucially, to his mother. Krista Cruz was not ignorant of what was happening to her son. According to the prosecution's case, she was aware of the abuse. She had been present during at least some of the incidents that caused James harm, and she had made no meaningful effort to remove her son from the danger he faced or to report what was happening to law enforcement or child protective services. This failure, the failure to act, to intervene, to place her son's safety above whatever other considerations were guiding her choices, was the basis of the criminal charges brought against Krista Cruz. She was charged with child abuse resulting in death, a charge that New Mexico law applies not only to those who directly cause a child's harm, but to those who, by their neglect or failure to act, contribute to the conditions in which that harm occurs. Also arrested and charged in connection with James Dunkley's death was Pamela Esparza, a close friend of Krista Cruz's whose role in the case will be explored in greater detail in a subsequent case in this documentary. The fact that multiple individuals faced criminal accountability for what happened to James Dunkley reflected the extent to which the abuse he suffered was not a hidden secret, but a reality that multiple adults in his life had been aware of and had failed to address. The investigation into James Dunkley's death was led by the Albuquerque Police Department in coordination with the Bernalillo County District Attorney's Office. The evidence assembled by investigators was thorough and damning. A portrait of a child who had been failed at every level, from the individual adults who were supposed to care for him to the broader systems that had not caught the warning signs in time. Krista Cruz's legal proceedings moved through the Bernalillo County court system over the course of several months. She faced the full weight of a prosecution that was determined to secure meaningful accountability for a child whose suffering had been allowed to continue unchecked. The evidence against her was substantial, and as the legal process unfolded, it became clear that the prosecution had built a case that left little room for doubt about Cruz's awareness of the harm being done to her son. Krista Cruz ultimately pleaded guilty. In her guilty plea, she acknowledged her criminal responsibility for the events that led to James Dunkley's death. A formal, legal acknowledgement that her failure to protect her son had contributed directly to the outcome that investigators had documented. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison. The sentence, which was handed down by a Bernalillo County judge, was intended to reflect the seriousness of her failure and to serve as a statement of the court's commitment to accountability in cases of child neglect and abuse. 10 years. For many who followed the case, for child advocates, and for members of the public who had come to know James Dunkley's story through media coverage, the sentence felt insufficient relative to the enormity of what had happened to a 4-year-old boy. These reactions are understandable, and they reflect a deep and legitimate sense of moral outrage at the suffering of an innocent child. At the same time, the legal process operates within constraints and frameworks that are designed to ensure consistency and proportionality. And within those constraints, the court determined that 10 years was the appropriate accountability measure for the specific charges to which Cruz had pleaded guilty. James Dunkley deserved a mother who would have protected him at any cost. He deserved an adult in his life who placed his safety above every other consideration. He was 4 years old, still at the age when a child trusts completely, loves unconditionally, and has no capacity to advocate for his own protection. He needed the adults around him to do that for him, and they failed. His story is a reminder that child protection is not only a matter for formal institutions. It is a community responsibility. Teachers, neighbors, family members, family friends, Every adult who comes into contact with a child is part of that child's safety network, whether they think of themselves that way or not. If you see something that concerns you about a child's well-being, please say something. The call you make could be the intervention that changes everything. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline is available around the clock at 1-800-4-A-CHILD. You do not need certainty to make a report. You only need concern. James Dunkley was 4 years old, and he deserved so much better. We honor his memory by staying vigilant, by speaking up, and by refusing to look away when children need us to see them. If this case hit close to home for you, please leave a comment below. Your thoughts matter to this community. And if you're new to the channel, welcome. Please subscribe to Cold Case Time and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Every subscribe helps this channel continue doing the work of telling these stories with the seriousness and respect they deserve. Case 6. Marcella Vasquez Montelongo, 2023, Albuquerque, New Mexico. There is a form of harm that leaves no visible bruising, no immediate signs of physical trauma, no dramatic moment of crisis that prompts an emergency call. It is a form of harm that operates slowly, gradually, quietly, harm that accumulates day by day, meal by meal, or rather the absence of meals, until a child's body begins to fail in ways that are both entirely preventable and utterly devastating. It is the harm of starvation. And it is, in the documented record of child maltreatment, one of the most disturbing expressions of parental failure, precisely because it requires not an act of violence, but a sustained act of withholding, a daily, deliberate choice not to nourish a child who depends entirely on the adults around them for survival. The case of Marcella Vasquez Montelongo is a case about starvation. It is a case about a 5-year-old boy with significant medical needs who was allegedly allowed to deteriorate to a point that defied comprehension by those who ultimately discovered his condition. It is a case that unfolded in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in 2023, and that exposed a series of failures, individual, familial, and institutional, that had allowed a vulnerable child to suffer in plain sight for far longer than any child should ever suffer without intervention. The child at the center of this case was 5 years old and described in investigative and media reports as medically fragile, a term that in this context refers to the fact that he had existing health conditions that required careful medical management and nutritional support. Children with complex medical needs are among the most vulnerable of all vulnerable children, precisely because their conditions make them dependent on consistent, knowledgeable, and attentive care. When that care is absent, the consequences can escalate more rapidly and more severely than they might for a child without pre-existing health challenges. According to the charges filed against Marcella Vasquez Montelongo and the investigative findings that supported those charges, her son had been subjected to a prolonged period of severe nutritional deprivation. When authorities became aware of his condition and he received medical evaluation, the findings were described in reports as shocking even to experienced medical professionals. The child weighed only 13 pounds at the time of his death, a weight that is catastrophically below what would be expected for a 5-year-old child, even with significant medical complications. The severity of his malnutrition reflected not days or weeks of neglect, but a sustained pattern of inadequate care that had gone on for a significant period of time. The question of how a child in this condition had not been identified and removed from a dangerous situation sooner was one that haunted the investigation and the subsequent legal proceedings. Children with medical needs are typically involved with healthcare systems. They have appointments, checkups, interactions with medical professionals who are trained to recognize signs of malnutrition and neglect. How had this child's condition deteriorated to such an extreme degree without triggering the kind of intervention that should have followed the first signs of serious malnutrition? These questions pointed, once again, to the complex web of systemic failures that recur across so many of the cases in this documentary. Questions about the coordination between medical professionals and child protective services. Questions about the adequacy of follow-up when children with known medical needs miss appointments or show signs of deteriorating health. Questions about the resources available to caseworkers, the size of their caseloads, and the degree to which those caseloads allow for the kind of careful, persistent monitoring that the most vulnerable children require. Marcella Vasquez Montelongo was charged with child abuse resulting in death, a charge that reflected the prosecution's determination that the death of her son was the direct result of the neglect to which she had subjected him. The case drew significant media attention in Albuquerque and across New Mexico, in part because the details of the child's condition were so extreme, and in part because the case came at a time when the state's child protective services system was already under significant scrutiny following a series of high-profile cases involving child deaths. The legal proceedings moved forward through the Bernalillo County court system, and Marcella Vasquez Montelongo was held in custody at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Albuquerque as her case progressed. In May of 2024, before the legal proceedings against her had reached a final resolution, she passed away while in custody at the Metropolitan Detention Center. Her death while awaiting the outcome of her case added another layer of complexity to a situation that was already deeply fraught, and it meant that the formal legal chapter of her case concluded without a verdict or sentencing that many in the community had hoped would deliver a full measure of accountability. The death of a defendant before the conclusion of their criminal case is a legal and human reality that the justice system is periodically forced to confront. It does not alter the facts of what the investigation found. It does not change the reality of what the 5-year-old child at the center of this case experienced. And it does not diminish the community's legitimate grief and anger over the circumstances of his suffering and his death. For child protection advocates in New Mexico, the Montelongo case became another data point in an ongoing and urgent argument about the need for stronger, better resourced systems to protect children with complex medical needs. These children are among the most dependent on the proper functioning of those systems, and their cases illustrate with painful clarity the human cost of systemic gaps and failures. The 5-year-old boy at the center of this case deserved to be nourished, cared for, and given every possible support to navigate the medical challenges he faced. He deserved a childhood. He deserved to grow up. He weighed 13 pounds when he lost his life, and every pound he should have weighed beyond that number represents a failure that was shared across individuals and institutions, and that demands accountability, reflection, and change. If you are concerned about the nutritional or medical well-being of a child you know, please do not hesitate to contact your local Child Protective Services agency or the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline. Early intervention is the most powerful tool we have. Please hit the like button on this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Cold Case Time. These stories need to be told, and your support ensures that they are told with the depth and respect they deserve. We read every comment, and this community means everything to us. Case 7. Pamela Esparza, 2019, Albuquerque, New Mexico. Earlier in this documentary, we told the story of James Dunkley, a 4-year-old boy in Albuquerque whose life was cut short as the result of a pattern of sustained abuse that took place within his home, and whose mother, Krista Cruz, pleaded guilty to child abuse resulting in death for her failure to protect him. James's story, as heartbreaking as it was, did not end with the actions or inactions of his mother alone. Because in the orbit of that household, in the circle of knowledge and silence that surrounded the abuse of a 4-year-old boy, there was another adult who knew what was happening and who made her own choice to do nothing about it. That adult was Pamela Esparza. Pamela Esparza was Krista Cruz's best friend. She was a woman who had regular access to the household where James Dunkley lived, who was present during visits that exposed her to the reality of what was happening to that child, and who, according to the investigation and the evidence presented in her own legal proceedings, was not merely a passive bystander but an active participant in the environment of harm that surrounded James in the final period of his short life. The case of Pamela Esparza is in some ways a companion case to that of Krista Cruz, and it is included in this documentary because it illustrates a dimension of child abuse cases that often receives less attention than the actions of the primary perpetrators. The role of the extended social circle, the friends and acquaintances and other adults who have knowledge of abuse, who may even witness it, and who make the choice to remain silent. Understanding why people in these circumstances remain silent, why adults who know that a child is being harmed do not report it, do not intervene, do not walk away and call the authorities, is one of the most important and least comfortable questions in the child protection landscape. The reasons are varied and often interconnected. Loyalty to the primary caregiver, fear of social consequences, the normalization of violence within certain social environments. The belief, sometimes genuine and sometimes self-serving, that the situation is not bad enough to warrant outside intervention. The failure to recognize that what they are witnessing represents criminal behavior rather than a private family matter. In Pamela Esparza's case, investigators built an evidentiary record that went beyond passive silence. According to the prosecution's case, her involvement with the household and her awareness of what James Dunkley was experiencing was substantial enough to make her not just a witness who had failed to report, but a participant who shared in the criminal responsibility for the outcome. Esparza was charged with child abuse resulting in death, the same charge that had been filed against Krista Cruz. The charge acknowledged the prosecution's determination that her role in the events surrounding James Dunkley's death was sufficient to hold her criminally accountable, even absent evidence that she had been the individual who directly and physically caused the injuries that ended his life. The legal proceedings against Pamela Esparza moved through the Bernalillo County court system in a process that ran parallel to and partly intersected with the proceedings against Cruz. Evidence was presented, testimony was heard, and the full extent of what Esparza had known and what she had done, or failed to do, was laid out in the evidentiary record. Pamela Esparza was convicted and sentenced to 13 years in prison. The sentence, 3 years longer than the sentence handed down to Krista Cruz, reflected the court's assessment of her role and her culpability in the events surrounding James's death. For those who followed both cases closely, the relative sentences raised questions about the hierarchy of accountability, about how the law allocates criminal responsibility when multiple individuals contribute through a combination of action and inaction to the death of a child. 13 years is a significant sentence. But for many child advocates and members of the public who were familiar with the details of the case, the more important message was the one embedded in the decision to prosecute Esparza at all. The message that the legal system takes seriously not only the actions of those who directly harm children, but the choices of those who know about that harm and allow it to continue. That message is one of the most important that the criminal justice system sends in cases of child abuse. Because child abuse rarely happens in total isolation, there are almost always other adults in a child's orbit who have varying degrees of awareness. A teacher who notices something off, a neighbor who hears things through walls, a friend of the family who sees a child flinch or notices bruising and files the observation away in a mental drawer labeled, "Not my business." The Esparza case is a reminder that there is such a thing as making harm your business, that the choice to stay silent in the face of a child's suffering is not a neutral act but a choice with consequences, including potentially criminal ones. James Dunkley was surrounded by adults who failed him, his mother, her friend, others in the household. He had no voice capable of reaching outside those walls. He was dependent on the moral choices of the adults around him, and those adults let him down. His memory demands that we take seriously our own responsibilities as members of communities where children live, that we pay attention, that we ask questions when something seems wrong, that we make the call when we should. James was 4 years old, and he deserved so much better. If you know of a child who may be experiencing harm, please contact the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-4-CHILD. A single phone call from a concerned adult can save a child's life. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Cold Case Time, and hit the bell notification. Your support keeps this channel alive and ensures that children like James Dunkley are never forgotten. Leave a comment below. We want to hear from you. Case 8. Lucia Naranjo. 2024. Aztec, New Mexico. The cases that have populated this documentary thus far have been, in their most fundamental essence, cases about the harm that mothers have caused to the most vulnerable people in their immediate circles, their children. They are cases that speak to the specific and profound responsibilities of parenthood and to the devastating consequences when those responsibilities are abandoned, betrayed, or weaponized. But the landscape of cases involving women who have committed or been accused of serious crimes in New Mexico is broader than the category of child harm alone. And understanding the full scope of that landscape requires looking at cases that cross into other arenas of domestic tragedy. The case of Lucia Naranjo fits within a different but related framework, a case that took place not between a parent and a child, but between a husband and a wife, within the walls of a home in the small city of Aztec in San Juan County, New Mexico. It is a case that raises questions about the dynamics of intimate partner relationships, about the circumstances that can lead to explosive and fatal violence between people who share a life together, and about the way in which law enforcement and the courts navigate the complex human terrain of domestic situations that end in irreversible tragedy. Aztec is a city of approximately 7,000 people in the northwestern corner of New Mexico, situated in the high desert landscape of the San Juan River Valley. It is a quiet, relatively small community by the standards of most cities, a place where the rhythms of daily life tend toward the routine and the familiar, and where serious crimes are notable precisely because of how unusual they are in the context of the community's day-to-day experience. In 2024, that quiet was shattered when San Juan County Sheriff's Office deputies responded to a call from the Naranjo residents and discovered a scene of fatal domestic violence. Richard Patterson, Lucia Naranjo's husband, had been shot inside their home. He did not survive his injuries. What followed, the investigation, the arrest, and the evidence that would form the basis of the case against Lucia Naranjo, unfolded over the course of hours and days with a swiftness that reflected both the clarity of the physical evidence and the significance of a piece of evidence that investigators considered particularly telling. According to the investigation and the charges filed against her, Lucia Naranjo had shot her husband Richard Patterson in the head. The shooting took place inside their shared home, in circumstances that investigators worked to reconstruct through physical evidence and through conversations with Naranjo herself. It was those conversations, specifically a phone call that Naranjo made in the aftermath of the shooting, that became one of the most significant evidentiary elements of the case. In that phone call, investigators alleged Naranjo admitted to the shooting. She told the person she was speaking with what she had done. Whether she was seeking help, seeking to confess, or in a state of shock following the events in the home is a question that the evidence may or may not be able to fully answer. But the content of that call, the admission it contained, was documented by investigators and became a central piece of the prosecution's evidentiary foundation. What investigators also noted in their reporting on the case was the emotional tenor of Naranjo's response when she was informed by law enforcement of Richard Patterson's death. According to reports from the San Juan County Sheriff's Office, she showed what investigators described as little emotional response upon being told that her husband had lost his life. This observation, made by trained law enforcement professionals who are experienced at reading human responses in traumatic situations, became part of the narrative surrounding the case, though its legal significance would ultimately be determined by the courts rather than by public opinion or media coverage. Lucia Naranjo was charged with second-degree murder and with tampering with evidence, the latter charge suggesting that, in addition to the act of shooting itself, investigators had found evidence that she had taken steps in the aftermath to alter, conceal, or otherwise interfere with the physical evidence in the case. The tampering charge added a layer of deliberateness to the prosecution's portrait of Naranjo's behavior, suggesting that even in the immediate aftermath of the shooting, she had been thinking, calculating, and acting in ways designed to manage the evidence of what had occurred. The combination of the admission in the phone call, the physical evidence at the scene, and the tampering charge made the case against Lucia Naranjo appear, from the prosecution's perspective, both substantial and compelling. Defense attorneys, in the early stages of the proceedings, worked to build a counter-narrative, one that would address the full context of the relationship between Naranjo and Patterson, the dynamics of their marriage, and any factors that might bear on questions of intent, premeditation, or the circumstances that had preceded the shooting. In cases of intimate partner violence that result in one partner taking the life of another, the context of the relationship is always relevant to a full understanding of what occurred. The history of the relationship, any documented incidents of prior conflict, any evidence of threats or harm in the period leading up to the fatal event. All of these contextual factors bear on the legal proceedings and on the public's understanding of a case that might otherwise be reduced to a simple and misleading narrative of aggression and guilt. The Naranjo case was still in the early stages of legal proceedings as of the most recent available reporting, with the charges having been filed and preliminary hearings having taken place in San Juan County. The full legal chapter of this case, the trial or resolution that will ultimately determine the formal outcome, was still ahead. What is clear, regardless of how the legal proceedings ultimately conclude, is that Richard Patterson lost his life inside his own home. He was a husband, a member of a community, a person whose existence had meaning and value, and whose loss created a void in the lives of those who knew him. His story deserves to be told with the seriousness and respect that every victim of a fatal act of violence deserves. And Lucia Naranjo's story, the full story, including whatever context and circumstances surrounded the events of that day, deserves the careful examination that the legal process is designed to provide. Justice, in its most complete form, requires that the full truth be established through due process, through the presentation and evaluation of evidence, and through the application of the law in a proceeding that respects the rights of the accused even as it pursues accountability for the victim. The community of Aztec, like every community touched by a sudden and violent domestic tragedy, was left to process both the shock of what had occurred and the questions it raised about relationships, about warning signs, and about the resources available to couples and individuals in crisis before situations reach a fatal breaking point. Domestic violence prevention resources are available through the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE. Whether you are in a situation of concern yourself or are worried about someone you know, trained advocates are available around the clock to provide support, safety planning, and referrals to local resources. Richard Patterson's life mattered. His story deserves to be remembered with the full humanity that every victim deserves. If this story moved you, please like this video and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Subscribe to Cold Case Time and hit that notification bell so you never miss another case. Every member of this community helps us continue telling these important stories. Case 9. Elizabeth Ortiz-Chavez. 2022, Albuquerque, New Mexico. There is a particular quality of betrayal that distinguishes certain criminal cases from others. A quality that emerges when someone not only commits a serious crime but then, in the aftermath of that crime, makes a choice so cold, so calculated, and so morally devastating that it becomes, in some ways, even harder to comprehend than the original act. The case of Elizabeth Ortiz-Chavez contains just such a quality. It is a case with a shocking twist at its center, a twist that reveals not simply the commission of a crime, but the willingness of one person to sacrifice an innocent family member to escape the consequences of their own actions. Elizabeth Ortiz-Chavez was a resident of Albuquerque, New Mexico. She was a mother, a fact that is relevant not because her status as a parent was directly implicated in the initial act at the center of this case, but because of the identity of the person she chose to sacrifice in her attempt to avoid accountability. The victim of Elizabeth Ortiz-Chavez's initial act of violence was a teenage boy, her daughter's boyfriend. And the person she chose to blame for that act was her own son. The circumstances that led to the fatal shooting of the teenage victim began with a confrontation. The precise nature of that confrontation, what was said, what preceded it, what history and dynamics existed between Elizabeth Ortiz-Chavez and her daughter's boyfriend, became part of the evidentiary record as investigators worked to reconstruct the events of the day in question. What is clear from the evidence presented in the subsequent legal proceedings is that the confrontation ended with Elizabeth Ortiz-Chavez producing a firearm and using it against the young man. He did not survive. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, as law enforcement arrived at the scene and began the process of establishing what had occurred and who was responsible, Elizabeth Ortiz-Chavez made a decision. Whether that decision was made in a moment of panic, in a calculated assessment of her legal situation, or in some combination of both, is a question that the evidence cannot fully resolve. What the evidence does reveal is the decision itself. She attempted to direct suspicion away from herself and toward her son, apparently operating on the belief, the cold, deliberate belief, that as a juvenile, her son would face less severe legal consequences than she would. This act of attempted frame-up, the decision to offer up her own child as a substitute for her own accountability, is the element of the Ortiz-Chavez case that makes it so distinctive in the landscape of New Mexico criminal cases. It is not simply a case of a person committing a crime and hoping not to get caught. It is a case of a person committing a crime, making a calculated decision to implicate an innocent family member, and doing so in the apparent belief that the youth of her son would function as a kind of legal cushion, a buffer between her own actions and their consequences. The investigation into the shooting was conducted by the Albuquerque Police Department, and detectives moved methodically through the evidence to establish the full truth of what had occurred. Physical evidence, witness accounts, forensic analysis, and the inherent inconsistencies in the initial account that had been provided all contributed to an evidentiary picture that began to diverge significantly from the narrative of innocence that Elizabeth Ortiz-Chavez had attempted to construct. As the investigation deepened, the frame-up began to unravel. Investigators identified the inconsistencies between the physical evidence and the account being offered. They pursued those inconsistencies with the tenacity that professional investigators bring to cases where the initial account does not align with what the evidence shows. And gradually, through the accumulation of forensic and testimonial evidence, the truth emerged that Elizabeth Ortiz-Chavez had been the individual responsible for the shooting, and that her son had been falsely identified in an attempt to deflect that responsibility. The legal consequences of that unraveling were significant. Elizabeth Ortiz-Chavez was arrested and charged with second-degree murder for the death of her daughter's boyfriend. The attempted framing of her own son added a dimension of moral complexity to the case that resonated deeply with those who followed it. Here was a woman who had not only taken a life, but had then attempted to place the legal weight of that act on the shoulders of her own child. A child whose only relevant characteristic in her calculation had been his age and the legal benefits that age might provide her. The case drew significant media attention in Albuquerque and was reported by KRQE, KOB, Law and Crime, and other outlets that cover New Mexico's legal landscape. The human dimensions of the story, the teenage victim, the daughter whose boyfriend had been shot by her own mother, the son who had been falsely implicated, made it a case that touched on almost every conceivable dimension of family tragedy and dysfunction. Elizabeth Ortiz-Chavez ultimately pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The plea came after the evidentiary case against her had been established, and it represented a formal acknowledgement of her criminal responsibility for the death of the young man who had been her daughter's boyfriend. She was sentenced to 18 years in prison, a sentence that reflected the seriousness of the charge and the court's determination of appropriate accountability for both the shooting and the circumstances that had surrounded it. 18 years. For the teenage victim who lost his life, for his family and friends, for those who had known him in his brief time in this world, the sentence carried the weight of an accounting for something that could never be fully accounted for. A young man had lost his life in a confrontation that did not need to end the way it did, and then his death had been used as a tool in a calculated attempt to frame an innocent person. The compounded injustices of this case are substantial, and the 18-year sentence was the legal system's best attempt to respond to them. For the daughter whose mother shot her boyfriend and whose brother was falsely implicated, for the family members who had to live with the full reality of what Elizabeth Ortiz-Chavez had done, the legal resolution provided accountability, but not healing. That kind of healing, if it comes at all, comes from elsewhere, from time, from support, from community, from the slow and difficult work of rebuilding a sense of safety and normalcy in the aftermath of catastrophic family loss. The teenage victim at the center of this case was a young man with a life ahead of him. He was someone's son, someone's friend, someone's love. He deserved to grow up and become all the things he might have become. His life and his loss deserve to be remembered with the full weight of human dignity that every victim is owed. If this story raised questions for you about the importance of accountability and the protection of innocent individuals within the legal system, we encourage you to stay engaged, to follow the work of victim advocacy organizations and legal reform efforts in your state and community. Please like this video, leave a comment with your reaction to this case, and subscribe to Cold Case Time. Cases like this one are exactly why this channel exists, to make sure that justice, accountability, and the memory of victims are never reduced to simple headlines. Case 10. Linda Henning. 2002, Albuquerque, New Mexico. Every documentary that examines the darkest chapters of human behavior eventually arrives at a case that possesses a quality of historical weight, a case that was not only significant in its own time, but that left a permanent mark on the legal and cultural landscape of its community. The case of Linda Henning is exactly such a case for New Mexico. It is a case from the early years of the 21st century that combined elements of obsession, conspiracy, and profound violence in ways that captivated the attention of the entire state, generated national media coverage, and established legal precedents that endure to this day. To understand the Linda Henning case fully, you must first understand the man at the center of the story, a man whose own behavior was so bizarre, so layered with deception and manipulation, and so ultimately destructive that his impact on everyone around him, including Linda Henning, is impossible to separate from the tragedy that followed. Diazien Hassenkopf was, by any clinical assessment, a profoundly disturbed individual. He was a man who operated through layers of fabrication and manipulation, constructing a persona and a reality around himself that bore little relationship to the truth. He claimed to be a medical doctor. He was not. He claimed to have expertise in various scientific and medical fields. Those claims were fabricated. He claimed, most extraordinarily, to be an alien being, a non-human entity who had taken human form. He presented this claim not as metaphor or eccentricity, but as literal truth, and he found in Linda Henning a person who was willing to believe it. Linda Henning was a woman living in Albuquerque who became entangled in a relationship with Diazien Hassenkopf, a relationship that, according to the evidence presented at trial, became the vehicle through which she was drawn into participation in one of the most disturbing crimes in New Mexico history. She was, by accounts of those who knew her before she became involved with Hassenkopf, not a person with a prior history of violence or criminal behavior. What she became, the person who stood trial for her role in the disappearance and presumed death of Lucia Hassenkopf, was, in the prosecution's portrait, someone who had been transformed by her relationship with a manipulative, delusional, and deeply dangerous man. Lucia Hassenkopf was Diazien Hassenkopf's wife. She was a Malaysian-born woman who had immigrated to the United States and built a life in Albuquerque. She was, by the accounts of those who knew her, a quiet, hard-working woman who had found herself trapped in a marriage to a man whose behavior was erratic, controlling, and ultimately lethal. In September of 2001, Lucia Hassenkopf vanished. She was last seen in her apartment. When investigators arrived at the scene, they found evidence of a violent struggle, blood evidence, and physical signs of a confrontation that indicated she had not left voluntarily. Lucia's body was never found. This fact, the absence of a body, made the Hassenkopf case one of the most legally challenging investigations that New Mexico law enforcement had ever undertaken. Prosecuting a murder case without a body requires the most rigorous and comprehensive evidentiary work that prosecutors can undertake, because the defense's most obvious argument is that without a body, there can be no certainty that the victim is dead, let alone that she was killed by the defendants. New Mexico prosecutors nevertheless built a case of remarkable thoroughness. The evidence they assembled, forensic, testimonial, and circumstantial, pointed to both Diazien Hassenkopf and Linda Henning as having been involved in Lucia's disappearance and presumed death. Henning's own role, as the prosecution argued it, was not that of a reluctant bystander but of an active participant who had assisted Hassenkopf in carrying out and concealing the crime. The details that emerged from the investigation and subsequent trial were extraordinary even by the standards of major criminal cases. Investigators documented evidence suggesting that parts of Lucia Hassenkopf's remains had been distributed across a remote area of New Mexico, a finding that required extensive forensic work to document, and that formed a crucial part of the prosecution's evidence of death. The absence of a complete body did not mean an absence of evidence, and prosecutors used the fragmentary physical evidence, combined with witness testimony and the documented relationship between the defendants, to construct a case for conviction. Linda Henning's trial proceeded in 2002 and drew enormous public and media attention. It was a trial full of dramatic moments that reflected the extraordinary nature of the case, the bizarre dimensions of Diazien Hassenkopf's world, and the human story at the center of everything. The story of Lucia Hassenkopf, a woman who had come to America seeking a better life and who had instead found herself at the center of a fatal conspiracy. Linda Henning was convicted of first-degree murder. The conviction, in a case without a complete body, based on the strength of the circumstantial and forensic evidence assembled by prosecutors, was a landmark moment in New Mexico legal history. It demonstrated that the state's prosecutors and courts were capable of securing a murder conviction in one of the most legally challenging categories of cases, and it sent a message to the community that the absence of a body would not be a shield against accountability. In a development that made the case even more historically significant, Henning became one of the first women in New Mexico in the modern era to face the death penalty. The state's decision to pursue capital punishment in her case reflected the severity of the crime and the prosecution's determination that the full weight of the law should be brought to bear on those responsible for Gurley Chu-Hasenkopf's death. Ultimately, Linda Henning was sentenced to 73 years in prison, a sentence that, for a woman of her age at the time of sentencing, constituted a de facto life term. She would not be leaving prison. The sentence was the legal system's definitive statement on the gravity of her crimes and the irreversibility of what she had taken from the world when Gurley Chu-Hasenkopf was taken from it. Diazien Hasenkopf was also convicted in connection with Gurley's death and was sentenced to an extensive prison term that similarly constituted a life sentence in practical terms. The conviction of both individuals meant that the two people the prosecution identified as responsible for Gurley's fate were held fully accountable, that the years of work by investigators, forensic professionals, and prosecutors had resulted in the outcome that justice demanded. Gurley Chu-Hasenkopf's story is one that deserves to be remembered with full recognition of her humanity. As a woman who immigrated to this country, who built a life, who faced circumstances beyond her control, and who deserved the protection and safety that every person living in the United States is supposed to be guaranteed. The fact that her story ended in tragedy does not diminish the value of her life or the significance of the justice that was eventually pursued in her name. The Linda Henning case remains, more than 2 decades after the events in question, one of the most analyzed and discussed criminal cases in New Mexico history. It has been the subject of documentary coverage, true crime podcast episodes, and academic legal analysis. It is a case that reveals the extraordinary depths of human cruelty and manipulation, but also the extraordinary dedication of the investigators and prosecutors who refused to let the absence of a complete body become an obstacle to justice. For the students of criminal law who study this case, and for the legal professionals who use it as a reference point for prosecuting homicides without bodies, it represents a landmark. For the community of Albuquerque and the state of New Mexico, it represents a moment of reckoning, a moment when the most challenging evidentiary circumstances were met with the most rigorous possible prosecutorial effort, and when justice, however incomplete it can ever be in the face of such a loss, was delivered. Gurley Chu-Hasenkopf came to America looking for the same things that every immigrant seeks: safety, opportunity, and the chance to build a life of dignity and meaning. She deserved all of those things. Her story is told here to ensure that she is not forgotten, and to affirm that no matter how complex the legal path, the commitment to accountability for those who take innocent lives must never waver. The Linda Henning case closes this documentary as one of the most historically significant cases in New Mexico criminal history, a case that challenged the limits of what prosecutors could prove, that tested the mettle of investigators and courts, and that ultimately delivered a verdict that honored the memory of a woman who deserved so much more than the fate she received. Justice, in Gurley's case, came in the form of 2 convictions and 2 sentences that ensured those responsible would spend the rest of their natural lives behind bars. It is not the same as Gurley being alive. Nothing could be. But it is the best that the law can offer, and in this case, the law delivered it fully. Thank you for watching this documentary with Cold Case Time. Every case in this film represents a real life, a real loss, and a real community that was changed forever by events it never should have had to endure. We tell these stories not for shock or sensationalism, but because the truth matters, because accountability matters, and because the victims at the center of these cases deserve to be remembered with dignity, with seriousness, and with the full weight of human compassion. If any of the issues raised in this documentary have affected you personally, please know that support is available. For child abuse concerns, contact the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-4-A-CHILD. For domestic violence support, contact the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE. For mental health support and crisis intervention, contact the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline at 988. If this documentary meant something to you, if these stories moved you, informed you, or changed the way you think about justice and community, please show us by hitting that like button right now. leaving a comment below with your thoughts on any of the cases, and subscribing to Cold Case Time if you haven't already. Hit the bell notification so you never miss a new documentary. Share this video with someone you know who cares about true crime and justice. This is Cold Case Time. We will be back with more stories that deserve to be told. Thank you for being here.